I've only been here 17 years. I'm a Flatlander. Springfield is now home. But I also like to say it took me 43 years to find home. Happy and I, my wife Happy and I, for years and years and years had tried to live in a rural environment. Ended up in the suburbs of Northern Virginia for 24 years. And we were very happy to leave that in 2007, and we ended up here. We ended up in New Hampshire for a lot of the reasons that have to do with taxation, the rural environment here in Springfield, which we like. And also our older son works up at Dartmouth Health. He's a physician assistant working in pediatric oncology. And it's good to have him close by. Picture this, 1964 to 66, Happy and I were living in the Bronx. I was teaching school. And then I got a letter from the Selective Service System saying show up for a pre-induction physical exam. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. Because in 1966, of course, what was going on in Southeast Asia was not pretty. About that time, my older brother came to visit, and he was going through flight training as a flight surgeon. He just finished medical school and said, this is really great. About 2 or 3 months later, I went out to Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, I guess it was, and came home and said, guess what, I just enlisted in the Navy. And Happy said, what? I reported for active duty in July of 66, commissioned in October of 66, and then finished flight training in December of 67. And had so much fun, I stayed at it for 20 years. I was commissioned with a reserve commission, and then applied to get a regular commission. The program they called it was augmentation, and that was approved by the Navy by a board in about 71. And then I went on to finish 20 years in August of 86. About 4,000 hours of flying at the controls, no flight violations. My version of flying in the Navy was land-based. I had to do some carrier landings to be designated a naval aviator, but that was, my version of flying was a 4-engine, multi-engine, land-based maritime patrol. This was Cold War stuff, 60s or 70s and 80s. Cold War stuff of tracking, our primary mission was tracking Soviet submarines. Secondary mission also was just maritime patrol, out there flying around the sea lanes to see what was out there. This is before the days of GPS, before the days of satellite, so we were the only ones. We'd go out there and take pictures of anything that happened to be in the sea lanes. So I spent my time in 3 different aircraft types. I can tell you that the way we tracked submarines was through sound underwater. All right, the Soviet submarines back then were quite noisy, and we had equipped in the airplane some what we called sonobuoys. These were little FM transmitters that we'd drop out of the aircraft, and it would drop a hydrophone 200 or 300 feet down. It would sit there and listen, and it would transmit sound signals to the airplane. And from there, we could localize and track these guys, and they had absolutely no idea we were there. None, no idea. Here I'm sitting up there at 25,000 feet listening to these guys. That was, we didn't, most of the maritime patrol that I did, of course, was just flying, going down the sea lanes to see who was there. One of the sea stories I had to tell that was just an awful lot of fun was I was deployed to Spain in a P-3 Orion on the Atlantic coast of Spain called Naval Station Rota. We were launched, my crew was launched on a flight to try to pick up some Libyan submarines from Libya. They were Russian Foxtrot submarines. And these guys were being pretty sneaky. They were on the service at night, trying to get through the Straits of Gibraltar. The airplane I was flying was equipped with something called a forward-looking infrared device, camera that could look out at night. And we picked these guys up immediately. I was up at 5,000 feet. They had no idea we were there. And I remember the operator saying, gee, it looks like a school bus down there. I circled around, lights out completely, dark and shit. And came across his beam, and about a half a mile out, I lit off a searchlight. 11,000 candle power carbon searchlight, and lit him up. And flew over him at about 200 feet. Circled around and came back, and of course by that time he'd pulled the plug. But I'm sure that intelligence got out that we know where you're at, you can't hide. One of the tours of duty I did was, I was sent to the Netherlands on something called the Personnel Exchange Program. And basically they were trading pilots. I went to an air station near The Hague, and a guy named Pete Forenkamp went to Jacksonville, Florida, and flew RP-3s. I went there and flew their Breguet Atlantique. I came home, as I've said before, I came home speaking English with a Dutch accent. I mean, I was absolutely fluent. And about 1,500 hours in that aircraft type too. The best story I have of that is at the controls and in command of an airplane, coming home from just a regular detachment in Iceland. Our operator from the electronic countermeasures picked up a Soviet radar, just passive. So we got a cut on him. We flew a little bit and we triangulated. He was about 200 or 300 miles out. It was a Soviet man-of-war, we could tell. So I dropped down about 200 feet and just followed it in. This was completely unbriefed. We had no idea that these guys were there. And I flew right into the middle of a Soviet anti-submarine warfare exercise. And all hell broke loose. Soviet airplanes, helicopters. I dropped a couple of sonobuoys. We could hear, and there was a Soviet sub down there. We were recording on Soviet UHF frequencies in English, and it was translated in very vulgar vernacular Russian, I heard later on. At one point I had a wing, on my wing, I had a Soviet airplane on my wing trying to push me out of there. I also had on a flight suit with an American flag on my shoulder, and I ripped that off because if they had known there was an American in there, or if it was an American airplane, it would have been an incident at sea. You would have read about it. I'm sure read about it in the New York Times. But that was more fun. We just hosed up their entire exercise. One little old Dutch airplane. We spent 3 years there. I was just incorporated, brought into the squadron like any other pilot. Went through training in their aircraft. In the Netherlands, this is now. At a naval air station at a Royal Netherlands, they called it a Vliegveld, called Valkenburg, north of The Hague. I was just another pilot that was brought into the squadron. People accepted me like anything else. These were hard drinkers, superlative airmen. I mean, just by comparison, some of the folks that I flew with in the U.S. were just amateurs compared to these guys. Anti-submarine warfare exercises, also just maritime patrol, reconnaissance out there, same pictures. And I made a lot of good friends. I still correspond with them, not in Dutch anymore. That airplane that I flew was a so-called Breguet Atlantique. It was a twin engine made by a consortium in Europe, specifically for maritime patrol, and it was junk. I had more problems with that airplane than I did any other type of aircraft. About 3 months before I arrived in the squadron, one had a water landing, ditched because of some control problems in the North Sea. And then about 4 years after I left, another one ditched at sea, in heavy seas this was. The side number on it was 255. I checked my logbook. I've got about 500 hours in that same airplane. That crash killed 3 people. All because of control problems, which I have found out since were hidden during the accident investigations. People weren't talking about it. I'm just now finding out stuff that I can see and read on the internet. Maritime patrol was described as hours and hours and hours of sheer boredom punctuated by moments of sheer stark terror, okay? The saddest story that I think that impacted me and my family more than anything else was an aircraft that took off out of the Azores, December 1977. And about 3 hours later, they were just going out on this routine maritime patrol to the sea lanes to see what's out there, and then they were going to land in Spain. At about 2,100 feet and descending on station in bad weather, they flew into an island in the Canaries. Just perfectly good airplane. That was picked up by, that story was picked up by the local newspaper that decided that there was going to be some, that there was more to it than just an accident. About 2 months later, one of our sister squadrons lost an airplane, and then about 2 months after that, another aircraft crashed. And here I am, I'm deployed again to Rota and the Azores, and my wife is at home reading all this junk in the Brunswick Times Record, Brunswick, Maine. I'm here to tell you that the backbone of the Navy is not people flying airplanes, it's not airplanes, it's not commanding officers, it's people at home. While she was reading all this junk about crashes and people trying to determine what happened and nobody was talking about it, at one point, a reporter got hold of the accident investigation report from the Freedom of Information Act, and there on the front page of the Brunswick Times Record, everybody could read that the navigator had cardiac heart disease. And the rumors flew all over town, of course, that the navigator caused the accident because he was having a heart attack. And here's my wife sitting at home reading this trash and getting phone calls. The kids kept going to school. Kids went off to Cub Scouts. Life as usual. When I came home, there was home. That's what the Navy's about. That was what the Navy's about. Been married to that lady now 60 years. Same lady I woke up with this morning. 2 fine boys. But there wasn't always just all flying. Those were what they called the sea duty tours, all right? We rotated sea duty and shore duty. My first tour of shore duty was as an assignment officer. I was the guy who was sitting in a bureaucracy determining who was going to go where on their next assignment. I was a detailer. The next and final tour of shore duty, I was brought back to the Navy military, to the Bureau of Personnel, and given a computer project to automate the production of officer orders. And it worked. Took me 2 years. A lot of moving parts in that. These weren't all just pilots and aircrew members. I mean, they're fathers and their husbands first. And knowing that your family is at home, safe, warm, and dry, that there's somebody there pushing the snow out for them, that the kids are going to school, is the most important thing going on, not that submarine down there. Being distant from them, this is, well, now before email, long before social media, long before messaging. Telephone conversation would go about $20 for 5 minutes, so we didn't do that often. There were monthly letters, and it was that support from home that kept everybody going. There's a saying in the Navy, of course, that you know the difference between a sea story and a fairy tale. A fairy tale starts off with once upon a time, and a sea story starts off with, hey guys, this is no ship.